This is Tommy's Outdoors 91, tommysoutdoors.com. Rewilding is a subject that I talk quite often in the recent episode of the podcast with my guests, and it's no different in this episode. Once again, we're going to talk about reintroduction of species once extirpated from their native range, and specifically about beavers. My guest and your guest today is Chris Jones, Restoration Director at Beaver Trust. And obviously, we started talking about Beaver Trust, how it was found and why, and what projects they're running at the moment, and how that reintroductions of beavers is going. But the main part of the podcast is our conversation about beavers, their life history, their ecology, the impact they have on the environment, how they're impacting other species that they're sharing the environment with, and stuff like that. So, if you're interested in this subject, bringing back species once extirpated, specifically beavers, you want to learn about beavers, this is definitely an episode for you. And as usual, before I let you enjoy this episode of Tommy's Outdoors, remember to like, share, rate, leave comments. This is all helping greatly. Whether you're listening to audio only version of this podcast, or whether you're watching that on YouTube, any sort of engagement helps me, helps the algorithm, and ultimately helps me a lot to put more episodes like this in the future. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, Chris Jones and Beaver Trust. Okay, Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks for asking me, Tony.
Very good. Listen, I was following for some time the, let's say, beaver. So how it started for me, I was following a beaver situation, let's call it, in Scotland. And then, one step to the next step, I come across Beaver Trust, and I come across your work that you're doing, and then I start learning more about beavers. And then I watch Beavers Without Borders, the film. And so I'm hoping to talk about all of that. But before we start, can you just, to give a context, tell us what Beaver Trust is, why it was founded, and how it was founded?
Yeah, okay. Well, Beaver Trust is a charity. It's a very typical, environmental charity. And we started about 18, 19 months ago. And we met initially, three of us met about March 2019 or so. And it was a chap called Ian Beath and James Wallace and myself. And we met for a coffee, and with a view to talking about creating a new environmental charity. And the thought originally was, amongst James and Ian, was that they would create a new charity to look at wildlife on farms, because British farm wildlife has been really badly affected by farming methods and so on over the last number of decades. And a lot of things are in steep decline. And I said, look, there's people already doing this. There are plenty of people in that arena. Where we need to be is in the realm of beavers. And not just because of the animals themselves, but because of what comes with them. Beavers restore the ecological function of rivers and streams, particularly in headwaters. Because streams and rivers, they go where they go. They have no respect for political boundaries. They just go everywhere. And so straight away, there's a very great potential for using rivers as a basis for nature recovery networks, which is a big part of the UK government's environmental plan going forward. So it seems to me that beavers were a very, very good way of achieving that, along with protecting river buffers and making our rivers better again.
Gotcha. So it was all hinged around beavers from the very start.
Very, very quickly, yes. I mean, we did talk about the other things a bit, but I just kept on saying, beavers is a place there is no NGO looking after them particularly, and there will be very big benefits from getting this species back. I'm generally not a single species person, but the effects of the beavers, especially in headwaters, are that they create habitat for so many other plants and animals. And I can tell you, we have some beavers here on my farm, and we have seen the most extraordinary gains environmentally.
Yeah. Oh, it's fairly young, 18 months. It's fairly young. It's not even 2 years. I didn't know that.
Very, very young. Yeah. It's something that probably should have happened, I guess, 10 years ago. But sometimes things just take time, and sometimes it takes, some individual people thinking that way for something to start off.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about now beavers as a species, right? Because they're rodents, they're aquatic rodents. So they're a little bit like a swimming rat on steroids, but they have a certain set of habits that make them unique. So can you just from the biological and ecological perspective talk us through beavers, how their habitat, their life history, like as an animal?
Okay. These animals, they are, as you say, aquatic rodents. They are herbivorous. They're the second largest rodent in the world. Two species, one in North America, one in Europe.
They're different.
Yes, they are very different, apart from to look at. When I say different, they're different genetically. They will not interbreed, or it'll be very, very hard to get them to interbreed.
Really? That's
yes.
Interesting.
So the American beaver, believe it or not, is slightly smaller than the European beaver, and they otherwise they behave in almost identical ways. They can live perfectly well in a lake or a big river, or in the very, very smallest of streams. All beaver need to do well is water and food. They need to have, about a meter of depth of water as a minimum, so they can have a place where they can have a concealed underwater entrance to their lodge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they've got a big river to live in, they don't need to build any dams. Okay, but if they're a small river, say they've only got 10 centimeters of water, they will build a dam to make the depth of water they need to live.
Oh.
Okay. So that's why they do that. Beavers are very like us. They're capable of working really, really hard, but if they don't have to work really hard, they're happy not to.
Uh-huh. Gotcha.
So the perfect place is in a big river or a big lake where they don't have to do any extra work making dams. Now, so they have this dam to protect their lodge, but also the beaver likes to swim everywhere. It doesn't want to walk across land. It's quite slow on land and is vulnerable to predators. And in the beaver's head, it lives in a world where there are wolves and bears and lynx and this kind of thing. And so the dry land is a dangerous place for a beaver to be. And they will come out of the water, but maybe only go 20 meters from the water to find some nice food, but not much more, very little going beyond that kind of distance. So the impacts of the beaver tend to be very close to the water. But if they detect some really tasty food just a little bit further away, they might then begin to dig a canal from the water out to that food, so they can swim to that food and eat and then swim back. Or indeed, they might be moving things back along the canal. They might be bringing branches or something like that back into the water. So that's that side of things. I think I said they're herbivorous. The action of creating these ponds in headwaters where previously there's not very much water lying about is that it lets a lot of other species take advantage of that. So what we found here is that we had lots of small fish in our stream. Now we've got quite a lot of quite big fish, and the fish are getting bigger because they've got food and they've got water. The beavers create habitat for all sorts of things. We've found a greater range of dragonflies, for example. And that's very much related to the range of habitats that the beavers are creating and the amount of water they're creating. We're finding that we have new birds on the site, and we have 8 bird records that we didn't have before. Now, 1 or 2 of those bird records may be entirely coincidental, but most of them are birds that need a lot of water, or they need something special that the beaver does. So, for example, we have willow tits now. Now, willow tits, this is the fastest declining woodland bird in Britain. They're very common in Poland, where you've got lots of beavers, but in Britain, we don't have very many at all. And we think it's because there is less and less deadwood in the environment. And the beavers, because they fell trees, they create a lot of deadwood.
Right.
And that's a great thing for them. Because there's more water and more fish, you get more kingfishers and herons and cormorants. You get birds like green sandpipers and shoveler ducks, for example. We've had both of those on our place because they like inland pools for certain times of the year rather than living on the coast. So, we've created there something which is really, really good for those birds. And we've also seen more mammals as well. In particular, we've seen a lot of water shrews, which we had very few of before, but we now seem to have a lot. And we have polecats, which we didn't really have before. Oh. And we see the polecats there quite frequently. And our polecat is a very good predator of rats. And where you get fresh water, you tend to get lots of rats as well. So the polecats are doing really well there. And so, there's a whole bunch of things going on. We have amazing bat numbers. And we've got quite a long-term study of bats going on now. And we have really, really big numbers, and not just big numbers, but a great diversity of bats. I think we're up to 9 species of bats now feed either directly over or very close to where those beaver ponds are now, which is really exciting. It's like, I like to say that what the beavers do in terms of biodiversity. If you imagine you have a river and it has wildlife in it, and let's say we say, okay, the river is a place where there's like a little fire of wildlife. You add beavers to it, it's like pouring petrol onto that fire. I mean, it is staggering how much.
And how long does it take for that fire to have a big, massive flames? In other words, how long, those impacts that you're just told us about, how long it takes from the moment you're introducing beavers and they start building their dams, and how long you take to see the effect?
I think there's a lot of factors, but what we saw here was basically within 1 year, within a year, we began to see some really interesting things, some really exciting things. And that has just increased since then. And one of the big impacts of the beavers is because they slow the water down so much inside their ponds, the water is moving so slowly, especially in the summer, that algae can begin to form. And you get quite a lot of algae in the water. And in the summer, the water becomes quite cloudy. And of course, algae, this is the basis of all our aquatic food chains. So it's like you're just making you're just making soup for wildlife to grow off. Where you get algae, you get things that eat algae, and so on and so on and so on, until you've got some nice big sort of
small fish and bigger fish and massive fish.
Exactly so, yes. And we found eels, for example. I've never seen such a big freshwater eel before. Nearly a meter long, I tell you, just massive. We've seen grass snakes, and grass snakes are specialist amphibian eaters. They love frogs and toads, and we've had breeding grass snakes on the site, and there's just so much stuff going on, and we are gathering more information all the time. I wish we had a team of people that we could just employ to do it, because I'm sure we miss things as well. We're not down there all the time, but there is stuff going on with that. It's a constant thing. New things turn up, and
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Listen, Chris. So can you tell? I just want to wind back a little bit and ask you about the differences between European and American beavers, because I presume that in the terms of impact on the environment, they're pretty much the same. So did they split at some point, evolutionary, or like how did that happen?
I'm sure they must have done that. They're, when you see them, they are so similar.
Yeah.
And I suppose it could be just an example of parallel evolution, but they do look so similar. Excuse me. The difference seems to be in their chromosomes.
Uh-huh.
They have different numbers of chromosomes, which, although they're very, very similar animals, that's why they can't interbreed successfully. I think in the Soviet Union, in the 50s, they managed to get some Canadian beavers to mate with European beavers, but the offspring were not healthy and they couldn't breed with anything, and it was just too right. But you know what the Soviets were like? They put enough time into anything if they wanted to try and make it happen, but it didn't work, sadly. After that, the difference is, as I say, that the American beavers are slightly smaller, and by that I mean by a really, really small amount, just grams on average. But their coat is the same, their teeth are the same, their skeletons look very, very similar. Some people say, oh, the shape of the face is a bit different, but I can't see it. And if you look at and we have actually American beavers in Europe. In Finland, for example, there's a population that was set up there in I think they came in the 30s, and they were set up there to help kick off a fur industry. And I think they're quite hard to keep in breeding captivity, and they breed quite slowly anyway. So it was the sort of thing, they put them in the wild, and then the idea was they'd harvest them. And so they're there, and it makes it a bit tricky because they're so hard to tell apart. You have to have a genetic fingerprint taken. So if you took beavers from Finland, you'd be in some danger of taking not European ones, but
that's and they're coexisting with the European counterparts in Finland, or is there only American population in Finland?
No, there are European beavers there as well. Now, I do not know if anything special happens when they meet. The beavers are incredibly territorial animals as adults, and certainly if unrelated animals meet, they would normally fight. And so I imagine that Canadian and European beavers would probably fight each other as well.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Listen, so the question I have now is, obviously, in UK, on the island of Great Britain, there were population of beavers, wild population of beavers, and can you explain what happened? Were they extirpated as pests? Were they extirpated because they were exploited commercially for their pelts? and like a little bit like how that situation developed and how we ended up with having no beaver or close to no beavers.
Okay, so the beaver is an incredibly useful animal. It has this wonderful fur, which has got two layers. There's an outer long hair, and then there's an inner much shorter fur, which is very dense, and it's very waterproof, and it felts really well, and so is amazing for making hats and fabric with, as well as just being a useful fur in its own right. But also they're quite good to eat. There's a lot of meat on a beaver, and the glands, the Thorium Glands, they have this substance in them which has been used for a variety of things over the centuries. It's been used in ancient medicine, particularly for treating headaches and that kind of thing, and it's been used as a basis for perfume, and also for believe it or not, vanilla essence to use in ice creams and that kind of thing. So
I heard that. That's a good thing to people who listening to that to know, like a vanilla essence comes from beaver casters.
And the headache thing, it's because they eat a lot of willow, and the willow is a basis for aspirin. Willow bark is and so it concentrates that in its body, and it ends up in the glands, and so that is potentially actually a real way to stop your headache. Who knows?
Very good. Okay, so I'm taking from that they were just exploited for commercially. That's why
I think exactly that. And what I suspect is, a beaver is quite a big animal. They're relatively easy to find and to catch, particularly in the small streams where they're building dams, because there's always a telltale place where if I dig here, I bet there's beavers living in that big pile of wood and so on. So they're relatively easy to catch, and so I think a long time ago, maybe thousands of years ago in Europe, they began to become a little bit scarce, and then exploited more and more. And as people got smarter about the medicine thing, for example, they became a specialist thing to do. One of the popes back in the 13th or 14th century, he declared that beavers were, because of its scaly tail, that they were really a fish, and so they could be eaten on Good Friday and this kind of thing. Yeah, the Catholic Church has a lot to answer for. And they really had everything going against them. And the reason they survived at all was magical. There were certain places in Norway and in the River Elbe in Germany, down in the south of France in the Rhone Delta, and then in parts of Russia and Belarus. Very small populations hung on in really remote places where people found it hard to find them, and they just pulled into the 19th century. And then, as people got a bit smarter about science and so on, I think they thought, well, perhaps we should preserve these animals. And initially, I think they preserved them to make them turn them into a resource again for fur and so on. The American beavers by then were pretty much gone, so they couldn't import it, and so that they thought they'd do that. And amazingly, the beavers have recovered now from maybe 1,000 individuals 120 years ago to in Europe maybe 1.5 million today, something like that. So they're slowly rebuilding.
That's a good news. Just one question about their impacts. You mentioned that if they live in big rivers where the depth of the water is the water is deeper, they're not doing their stuff. They're not building dams. Is it fair to say that then they don't have such profound ecological impact in the bigger rivers, bigger lakes? That's the small ones where we want them.
Yeah, this is something that I don't know enough about. Now, what I would say is the beavers have impacts wherever they are, and one of the things that they do is they burrow. And where you've got a big river, and where that river is protected by flood banks and so on, or the land is protected by flood banks, they might potentially burrow through those. And then when there is a flood, water could come straight out from the river into surrounding land. So that's quite a potentially bad impact. And if it's farmland, it could be a potato field or something, and suddenly it's under a meter of water. That's not so good. They do have impacts. Now, we should ask ourselves, in terms of ecology, what do those impacts mean? Does it mean that the floodplain is kept wetter for longer of the year? And I just think we ought to try and understand that. Where we go upstream into where dams are being built near the headwaters, then we get a lot of effects by holding up water, a lot of effects which can be useful for society and so on, because we hold water, which is useful for when there are periods of drought, which is becoming more common as we go along with climate change, but also in periods of flood. And again, we seem to be having more floods with climate change as well. If we are holding a lot of water upstream for a little bit longer, then this can help to prevent flooding or reduce flooding risk in downstream settlements. And so on my little stream, we've got a village downstream of us, about 2 kilometers, and we have the water from about 5% of our catchment comes through our land, and the beavers have got a little piece of that which they've completely altered. The peak of flood water leaving the beaver area now is much, much lower than the peak entering it. And it's not just lower, it's also delayed. So that it means that the contribution to a flood downstream is also delayed. Now, it may not be a big delay, maybe an hour, something like that. But if it means that we desynchronize the arrival of water from all the other tributaries, that must be having an impact. Now, I would hesitate to say that my one pair of beavers who live on 200 meters of stream, where 5% of the water comes from, I couldn't sit here and say that's why my village hasn't flooded for the last 3 years, whatever. But what I think I can say is that if we think about having, instead of one pair of beavers on 5%, what if we had 20 pairs of beavers on 100%? How would that look now when we had serious rain? And from what we observe, I think we could extrapolate there being a really considerable impact from having lots of pairs of beavers doing their work.
No doubt. So you have one pair of beavers?
Yes.
So tell me, how is it like, and maybe that's a good moment to kind of shift gears and start talking about reintroductions, about all these programs. But in your case, do they count like as wild beavers, or is it like a kind of like a private collection of yours?
No, our beavers were both born in captivity. One was born in Devon and one in Wales, and they've been brought down into a new captive situation. So, I mean, they're in a big enclosure where they can exhibit all their normal behaviors, but they can't just go off and go and live somewhere else if they want to. Having said that, they've made the territory very, very, very friendly to beavers. There's a lot of water there now.
Right. So tell me, because I think that the whole discussion really right now revolves around reintroduction of beavers, and I obviously talk about rewilding quite often on my episodes, but I'm just holding back that word, because there's a substantial group of people, when you say R word, they just tune out and they don't want to hear anything about it. So
it's very charged politically, I think, rewilding, and it's personally for me, I think it means too many different things to too many people. And I think it's not as useful as some ways of looking at this. And I like to think of restoration of ecological function, using wildlife to restore those functions, or where wildlife is absent. Maybe we do use domestic animals too, but there's nothing like a beaver. There is no substitute. Even people can't do what they do in the same way. So. I think that we're in a place now where, because of the incredible pioneering work done in this country over the last 20 years, and from learning what's been going on in Europe over the last 100 years, we can see that, I think, that those people who can look at it in a very dispassionate kind of way can see that the animal brings a great deal back to our environment, and they support a very wide range of other species. They do these incredible societal goods in terms of reducing flooding, reducing drought impact. In places which are prone to wildfire, they help to reduce the spread of wildfire. There's a whole range of things. And because of that, I think we almost have a duty to try to reintroduce this animal. Now, currently, you could say it is happening, because we're getting licenses granted by Natural England for enclosures such as I've got. There's kind of a moratorium on doing anything bigger than that at the moment. We can't just say, okay, this river, this could do with beavers, and just bring lots of beavers to that river and just let them go where they want to. That's not in the rules at the moment. But we have got examples of rivers in this country where there are wild beavers living, albeit in small numbers. There's Otter in Devon, there's a River Tamar between Devon and Cornwall, and there's River Stour in Kent, and there are one or two others as well, where there are, let's say, up to maybe low hundreds of beavers living. In Kent particularly, they've been living in Kent now for, probably 15 years plus, living wild there. And this is great news, and we don't hear about it generally because there are not many disasters coming from it. And I think that in itself is a really strong message, is that these animals can be in our countryside and live very close to us, and many of us may never ever be aware that they're there. They just go in the water and they do beaver stuff. Now, sometimes it's very obvious by them, say, cutting down trees. But if you don't walk by the river, you'll never see that. And sometimes they can cause floods by, say, blocking up a ditch or a culvert or something, and suddenly there's water where there wasn't before. But I think that all the impacts they create, if we want to, we can manage those. We've done it here, just on a few trees, just to show it can be done, by painting a mixture of sand and glue onto a tree. The beavers won't touch that because it hurts their teeth, so they won't touch. So there's a tree that's protected. You can also wrap wire around them. You can reduce the level of a pond. If too much land is being flooded, let's say, you can just put a pipe through the pond, which reduces the level of the pond. If you've got, let's say, you've got a field of potatoes next to the river and the beavers are eating the potatoes, you just put a small electric fence there, and that will deter them. So there are lots and lots of things we can do if we want to. Now, that's a bit different than the government saying, okay, we're going to reintroduce these animals now. I personally think that the impacts of climate change are so severe. There should be a conscious and logical and prioritized, mindful way of bringing these animals back. And I think in most countries around the world, including Europe, the government would probably have quite a bit to do with that. They certainly did in Germany. And it needn't be very expensive to do. It does need to be done carefully, so we don't put them in a place where they are definitely going to cause problems. I mean, there are one or two rivers in our country where I really think you would be taking quite a big risk by putting beavers there. So there are some places I'd say, okay, let's not do that. Let's put them in places, for example, in the west of the country, like Cornwall and Devon and Somerset and so on, where they can cause relatively little harm, but actually also do a lot of good. And I think, again, we can select those rivers where, for example, flooding is a problem. So my own river is definitely a good one to put beavers, because the village downstream has been flooded many times. And there are a lot of small places around the country, just villages, where no one's ever going to spend millions to protect them with concrete walls and so on, because they're too small. But we put these animals out there, and they can begin to make a big contribution to that. So
never mention the fact that it's much better to create the habitat for all those animals rather than put their concrete walls.
There is
because we've seen these examples of these tunnels.
Yeah. No, there's absolutely no doubt at all. If we look at biodiversity, there is nothing like a beaver for helping.
Yeah, Chris, tell me, for our listeners and for me as well, that situation that you're described. This is specific to England or England and Wales. So this is kind of separate in what's happening in Scotland.
Okay. Wildlife and wildlife management and all those functions are devolved in England, Wales, and Scotland. So what's happening in Scotland, and in particular the conflict around beavers on the River Tay, is completely a Scottish responsibility. And what happened basically was some beavers escaped in Scotland from private collections, if you like, a place like mine or places like mine. And the countryside and the rivers were just great for beavers, and they set up shop and had a very nice time, and began to make more beavers and so on, and the numbers have gradually spread. So there are now, we think, several hundreds of beavers living wild on the River Tay. Now, these are small numbers. In Poland today, there are tens of thousands of beavers. I'm not even sure if we're over 100,000 beavers in Poland today. And so these small numbers of beavers are fine, but they're quite widespread. And there are parts of that river system where there is very fertile land, very close to the river, where the land has been drained and is now at a lower level than the river. So the river's been protected with banks, and the beavers have the habit of burrowing into those banks. And then the next thing, the Scottish farmer, instead of having 100 acres of wheat, has got 100 acres of water, and that is not good. And so there's a serious problem. That the Scottish government was very, very slow to step in on this, and so farmers started to shoot the beavers and this kind of thing. Anyway, the beavers have now been adopted as a native animal in Scotland. But I was going to say, the critical thing is a farmer can get a license to go and shoot a beaver if he needs to. And in one sense, that's quite a natural way to go. But the point I would make is that the rest of Scotland, there are hardly any beavers at all, and we really need to have them out in a lot more places. So wouldn't it be more sensible to catch those beavers when they get into places where they can make trouble, to capture them and move them on to new territories in different river systems?
Yeah. Especially that relocating a beaver is much easier than relocating an elephant, right?
Oh, completely. And it's totally within our means. It's a little bit more expensive than just shooting them, because you've actually got to have the patience to catch them in a trap and find them in the trap in good time, and then transport it to somewhere where you can check out its health and everything, and then move on. So it's a little bit of cost involved, but it's not big. And the value of the beavers and what they do is so much higher than just a dead beaver.
Yeah, for sure. So if I get you correctly, so right now, beavers in Scotland have let's say, permission to live as a wild species, and they can.
They do. They do.
But in England, they're not. They're not considered native fauna.
They're not considered native. No, they're still considered as a species which is not normally resident, and it's an anomaly, and the government really needs to address that. As an absolute minimum, that has to be addressed.
Because there is a I presume like a fossil record or archaeological record of beavers actually being native to England and the one.
Absolutely, and not just fossils, but also in writing as well. Right into the 14th, 15th, and even 16th centuries, there are written records of beavers, and there are places around the country where you can find just through the land, you can see where beavers have been in the past and created certain landscapes. On my own farm, for example, we have a place where the stream is in a certain way. We say, well, how can that ever have been like that? Because it's too small to do that. So how did it ever get in that way 1,000 years ago or whatever? And the only answer that we can find is beavers did it. So, because they're the only ones who can do that stuff. So, I think that there is no shortage of evidence of them being here. And there is, I believe, I know we're not in the EU anymore, but when we were in the EU, by law, I think we had to look at introducing all of the extinct species that we've lost over the years. And beavers being one. If we talk about rewilding, beavers like the entry-level rewilding, the gateway rewilding animal, because it's not going to eat your kids or kill your pet or anything. It's not like bringing wolves or bears back, This is a big risk for us,
Yeah. This is and look, this is something that gets me even here in Ireland, where certain species that they're obviously present are classified as non-native or invasive in some sense, and it's like it is. I feel like this is just convenient, right? That in beavers, you mentioned that there are certain impacts that beaver may have on farming and other industries that are, let's say, suboptimal. And I think this is just a kind of convenience, right? Like, oh, we already got rid of them, so let's pretend they were never here, and now they're like not native and whatever. And then you have to go through all this process. And this is, again, something that this is not the first time mentioned on my podcast, that specificity of islands like Great Britain and Ireland is like you need to physically, by human hand, bring beavers, cut them loose. They cannot just swim down the river from the next country and they're here, right? So each time, like you mentioned, like in Scotland, the beavers all of a sudden appear. It's like, oh, there's certainly someone done something that they're there, and this is make it so much more difficult to get these things going, right?
Sure. Yeah, it is, and I think there are some really deeply entrenched philosophical issues around this. People like to have control. Farmers or farming has an unduly heavy influence on government. I'm not saying it shouldn't have influence, but I think it is out of balance. Really, I think that there is no kind of holistic view of the environment, and we're going to learn that we need that. In fact, we're learning it right now. And a thing I often go on about is our institutions, our government institutions. They are all kind of living in the 20th century. The people who run those are people my age, and they trained in let's say the 80s, the 70s and 80s, and so they've brought that culture from then. They've brought it into now, and actually we need the culture of now, here, right now. We're living in this emergency, and things are happening really, really, really fast. And our old-fashioned kind of unduly cautious, risk-averse way of continuing, we haven't got time for that now. If you're like the tiger of climate change, it's out of the cage now, and we better be doing what the hell we can to get it back in the cage, or at least if we can't get it back in the cage, to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think beavers are a part of that.
Yeah. Well, you're right, and you're not the first person to say on this podcast. This is about the control and about we used to and kind of relinquishing some of that control. And I completely agree that those big organizations, any big organization, and probably there's no organization as big as a government on any country, is like there's a number of people who are either scared of making a mistake or just don't care. Like, why would I put my ass on the line and do something? I'm just
exactly right. If you're a senior civil servant, you're coming towards the end of your career, but you're the man who makes decisions. You're coming towards the end of your career, and there's a big pension coming up. Do I want to do anything to upset my chance of getting that pension? Now that might be seen as an unduly cynical view, but there is no doubt at all that if we take this issue, we are behaving as if these animals are time bombs. We're scared, and actually, it's too late for that, because they're here, and they are going to gradually increase in numbers, very gradually, and they'll gradually spread, very, very gradually. Now that we understand that they're here and what they do, and we know that climate change is here, and we know what that does, shouldn't we make that conscious decision, say, okay, this is a situation that we can't control on this hand. What we can do there is we can make our landscape a lot more resilient by the reintroduction of this animal. So let's do it, shall we? And we can do it step by step. You can't just magic 10,000 beavers from somewhere overnight, not even from Poland. We just can't do it. It takes time. But we could say, okay, let's have a campaign now. Let's bring back a beaver a day for the next 10 years, and we put them in places very carefully chosen to be high priorities for all the reasons that we've talked about. And let's do that. And let's do it as if we think the emergency is real and that we need to do something about it.
Yeah. So tell me, what are there any campaigns that are going on at the moment? Any initiatives that you guys, Beaver Trust are engaged? Like what's because I presume you're working not only on these enclosures when you have beavers, but you also working, trying to change the policy, I guess, and kind of make an impact.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are three main planks to our work, if you like. One is on policy, which my CEO, who's James Wallace, he looks after, and he is almost constantly in direct communication with the government with ministers and with senior civil servants. So that's one. The next one is communications. And these are my colleagues, Sophie and Eva. And they
Shout out to Eva, who made this podcast possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And they are constantly working on spreading the knowledge of this animal through the country, through the population, with films like Beavers Without Borders, but also working with schools and colleges and local communities and so on. And my job is working directly with communities and landowners to get beavers back into more places. So the example I'm going to tell you about is one of several examples that we're working with at the moment. This one is a particularly nice one. A council in a village which has serious flooding. They've had a lot of money spent in the village to make it safe with concrete, and it has not worked. And they came to me last year in December and said, could we please get beavers back here? Could you help us to get beavers back? And I said, to help with the flooding. And I said, well, yeah, we could try, but how many farmers have you got who would be prepared to tolerate beavers? And they said, oh, one. So I said, okay, we'll stop right there. If it's just one, we may as well not even bother. Really, it would just be a token, and we're probably wasting our time. Anyway, they've now gone and got a list of 23 farmers who live in the land above their village, and they're getting more all the time. This is going to turn into a really interesting project where we have the community of the village speaking to the community of people who live in the land and matching their needs and so on, in order that we can solve this problem, or attempt to solve this problem using animals. And so far, we've got enough space to maybe bring back, instead of one pair, 4 pairs. And I think by the time we've finished, it will be somewhere, I hope, I'm touching the table now very firmly, I hope up to about 10 pairs maybe. This would be a really, really significant project.
Yeah. And is that, so what are the views of actually accepting the beaver as a wild animal in England? Because I presume that project is also going to be kind of like an enclosure, and make sure they're not going to go
I'm
outside.
hoping that we can. I hope this can be a very, very big enclosure of thousands of hectares, not with a fence all the way around it, but maybe a fence strategically by the river in some places, so they can't just go through and go everywhere. But I think the government is working on this. It takes a long time, but they're working on it. I would think that we're going to end up at a point in a year or two where the beaver is accepted as being a legitimate native species.
Right.
I think we're going to get there. Mm.
That's very good. Listen, I have a question, a little bit theoretical and a little bit in a fantasy land, but I'm curious about you, right? So we can qualify that, as you like. We're not advocating that. This is just a fun thought exercise. There is no record of beavers in Ireland, right? Like there's no fossil, there's no bones found. Like, I personally always ask the question, similar like with the wild boar, when everything indicates that wild boar were in Ireland, but there's no bones found. But then, like, why would they not be here? And I'm asking the same question, like, why beavers would not be here since they were on the island of Great Britain? But knowing that, and maybe parking, keeping in mind, but parking the whole societal conflict and everything, knowing that this is going to be, do you think, again, as a pure fantasy, as if you were, like a king of the world, would that be a good idea to try to reintroduce beavers to Ireland? very theoretically, I know that you can say that I don't know specificity, but like on the 1,000 feet level, is that something that strikes you as a good idea, or maybe it's like, well, maybe they were actually never there, maybe it's not a good idea?
I think that Ireland, in terms of its vegetation, is not very different from Wales or Scotland. I think it's been very heavily modified by human beings.
Yeah, I think it's a similar situation. Similar situation, right? We have a farmlands and timber plantation.
And I guess it's also been heavily. I mean, I don't know what the flooding situation is like in little villages. There maybe there are places which flood, maybe not. I don't know.
Oh yeah, flood, and then let's make the concrete channels.
Okay.
Standard procedure.
Maybe beavers would be a useful addition. I think if the vegetation was very different, I would question it. But I think the vegetation is nearly the same. That's to say, you've got vegetation which is very much adapted to being with beavers. In particular, things like willow and alder and poplar. So I don't see there'll be any terrible ecological damage, and also the kind of fish that you have will be adapted to beavers because the same fishes we have. I would think it would not be a particularly high risk enterprise, and maybe it's something that should happen.
Yeah. So to follow up on that, if you would have to give one advice to any of such organization in Ireland, hypothetically, right? I don't think there is any at the moment. Hypothetically, there's a group of people who think like, hey, it's a good idea to get beavers, maybe in a closure like yourself, and even to showcase. Because it's all about showcasing the great results, right? Let's showcase what they can do. And like, what would be your one advice to those people? Where to start? Would it be to start at the policy level and talking to politicians? Would it be at the level of, get permissions, bring back beavers and cut them loose on your land and see what's happened? Like, or maybe some more philosophical advice that you would give to that?
I suppose, firstly, I don't really like giving advice to people in different places because it's not my place to do so. But I always say this to my communities here. Listen, I'm going to come and help you to try and facilitate your project, but it's always your project. So now, if there was a determination to do it, I would say that you would need to have an ally in government. I think you need to have an ally who's a landowner with a nice big piece of land, and to fence it so that beavers couldn't disappear either downstream or upstream in any direction. But a piece of land with plenty of the right kind of habitat, and then just put some beavers there and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And by ally, you mean like I presume you mean someone specific person with name rather than theoretical ally that then going to be swayed by the political winds in different direction.
I think something. We're only a very small organisation ourselves, and I don't know how the wildlife sector is in Ireland, and we have to work through partnerships. We haven't got millions of pounds. We could just say, "Hey, we're gonna make a deal with this guy over here. We're going to put 100 million there." So we just don't have that capacity. But what we can do is we can leverage our knowledge and enthusiasm and so on with people who want to reach do certain things and reach certain aims. So if we can enlist those people at all the different levels, it could be a local community who get flooding, with local landowners who want to help, and with an NGO that is really into its wildlife and wants to try something, and slowly build up a project like that. And what I would say is that beavers are pretty easy to catch. That's why they went extinct in the first place here. So if there was something that was, if we discovered something that was deeply wrong with all this, we can collect them up.
Yeah, we'll just reverse everything. Listen, Chris, thank you for that. Can you tell us, how to support your work and how to support Beaver Trust for anyone who's listening to that and goes like, this is like a great thing, and I would like to, maybe give you those millions and millions of dollars or pounds, or maybe just just a small donation. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
You never know.
Yeah, no, sure. First of all, I'd invite you to our website. There are some great movies on that website you can look at, and there's some great information about what's going on with beavers. And you can meet some of the people that we work with on there. If you were able to make a donation, there's a donate button on the website, so you can do that electronically. But I think more than any of those things is contact us and talk to us. We're always really keen to talk to people who are interested and involved in this world, and throw ideas around. And we say every day is a school day. We're always learning, and people are getting hold of us to talk about things, and we're getting a lot of information that way. And talk to us. That is really great.
Right. Listen, thanks again for your time. I think you folks are doing an excellent job. And,
thanks.
I wish you all the best. And first and foremost, I think always in my head is like, once we can get the policy right in terms of recognizing that, this animal should be there, then automatically that opens the door for people who are willing to put the work to actually make sure it's there one more time. So again, great job. I wish you all the best, and thanks.
Tommy, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we're going to meet and talk about Poland one day.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.